Welcome to another installment of the Sounds of ERA. My name is Edward Johnson, a.k.a. Eddie, and I'm the president of InfoEd International. We're going to be speaking today with Todd Swavely from the University of Pennsylvania. Todd began his involvement with ERA systems back in 1999, and currently he's the director of ERA systems there. Todd is going to describe his experiences with ERA systems when he first started working with them. He's also going to give us his impressions of his first encounters with Fastlane. Welcome, Todd.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Describe what ERA systems, electronic systems, looked like when you joined the university.
The university had pretty limited systems. The agencies that we worked with had some pretty limited systems in that era as well, but there were a lot of ideas and a lot of things were blossoming around that time.
I know Fastlane was in place back then. What was your university's involvement with that system when you started there?
When I was working in the School of Medicine in the late 90s, we actually did a couple of submissions via Fastlane, and it was very, very new. Most investigators approached that with a lot of trepidation. It was not a mandatory system, obviously, back in those days. Volunteers were few and far between, but it was exciting in a way to get started and to get a foothold in that. But my experience was limited. The system, the Fastlane system at that time, while it was basically the same system that it is now, it's evolved tremendously over that period of time.
Now, I know you have been involved with FTP for some time. I think Penn got involved with it back in the early 2000s. Now, there's been kind of this struggle, if you will, at least when I recollect, because one of FTP's missions was trying to design or suggest an electronic solution that the government would use in its entirety. And I think there was a little resentment that NSF seemed to be like this rogue agency that was going off and doing their own stuff.
I suppose that it depends on who you talk to. NSF was out on the cutting edge for whatever it was at that time, and so they felt no constraints to move their system forward, and very few other agencies were doing anything, mostly working with their back office systems, primitively trying to port some basic data into some of them. There's a variety of opinions, and NSF has been pretty stalwart in their system and maintaining that, so their participation hasn't been as full-fledged in some efforts as maybe some other agencies like NIH.
Now, you guys do, not that you don't do your fair share of NSF submissions. My guess is probably, at least dollar-wise, and I'm not sure about volume-wise, a lot more PHS, NIH targeted research, correct?
Right. Two-thirds of our research funding portfolio is NIH money, so that'll give you an idea of volume-wise, like transaction-wise, they're going to be the preponderance of all our transactions, yes.
Now, I know that FDP, in their global sense to take over at least the U.S. federal electronic submissions, they were toying around with the 194 data set for some time. What was your recollection of how that evolved or how they were planning on using that? I know it ultimately got trumped by S2S, but I know they were really talked about that for quite some time.
There were a number of agencies that were using that for whatever they were doing. I suppose back office things, and O&R, I think, was one of the real leaders as far as experimenting or prototyping those kinds of transactions. I think that it was a good place to start. It was an existing transaction set, and at least it was a place to start. There was some agreement. It turned out not to be probably the best technology to use, but it was a good starting point, and it at least got people talking and bringing out the idea that we had to agree upon a data set. That remains the big challenge, agreeing on that data set for real, not just token agreement, but actually utilizing it the way it's intended.
Now, I remember looking at those data sets way back when, and, you know, we still use some of the legacy budget categories because a lot of them still apply. And at the time, you're looking at EDI, and I think, as you suggested, it was like, wow, we actually have something here that could potentially model every agency. Right now, looking back at EDI, of course, it's incredibly primitive. I believe NSF actually did have an EDI interface. I'm not really sure if it ever really got used, but I think they did have something. I'm not familiar with ONRs, though. Did ONR actually have something running?
Yeah, they did. They definitely had an EDI interface. Pretty limited experience with it because at the time that was really hot lot. The kinds of things that I was working on didn't really involve a whole lot of electronic submission. When I first started working in ERA here at Penn, it was really to have a look at our existing systems and evaluate what our requirements were. And before you can really do system to system, you have to have some sort of foundation in systems locally to start out with. I spent a lot of time more time worrying about building those tracking management systems and putting that foundation in place. And maybe not as much time experimenting, I'll say, in electronic submission, although certainly I was following it at conferences and at FTP and places like that. I didn't have a great deal of experience in that area, though I know ONR certainly did have the capability to do that.
Fantastic information, Todd. I really appreciate you taking the time to go through this. Other things come up. I hope you're willing to explain those or engage us in those topics as they evolve over time.
No problem at all, Eddie.